The morning Sallie Garrison walked into the livery stable at the edge of Caldwell, Kansas, with nothing but a busted wagon wheel, a dying mule, and a determination that could have stopped a freight train. She had no idea that the sun-darkened cowboy leaning against the rear stall would become the most important person she had ever known. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell was the kind of town that swallowed people whole. The cattle drives pushed through its dusty streets with enough noise and smell to wake the dead, and the saloons never truly closed. But Sallie had not come to Caldwell for the cattle or the whiskey or the card games that bled men dry by midnight. She had come because her brother, Thomas Garrison, had sent a letter 3 months ago from a small homestead 30 miles north of Wichita, and then had gone completely silent. The letter had been short and written in Thomas's cramped handwriting, the kind of penmanship that came from a man who had only ever learned to write by candlelight with a stub of pencil. He had said he was in trouble. He had said he owed money to a man named Harlan Croft, a man whose name even the paper seemed afraid to carry. He had said that if Sallie did not hear from him again within 2 months, she should come and look. She had waited the 2 months, and then 2 weeks more, because she could not afford the stage fare and because her own mule, old Beauregard, had decided that February was the month to begin his slow decline toward the inevitable. By the time she had gathered enough money from mending clothes and washing linens for the hotel in Abilene where she had been living since their parents died, it was late March, and the roads were half mud and half ice. She had made it as far as Caldwell before one of the wagon wheels split clean down the middle on a rut the size of a small canyon, and before Beauregard had lain down in the traces and simply refused to get up again. The veterinarian she had found told her in a voice that carried genuine sorrow that Beauregard was done. His heart was giving out. He would not survive another 20 miles. That was how she had ended up standing in the livery stable with grit on her boots and her brown hair half escaped from its pins, asking the man at the front desk if she could borrow a horse for a week. The man at the front desk was not the owner. The owner, a stout German named Otto Krace, was busy arguing with a cattle drover in the yard. The man at the front desk was simply a cowboy who had set his coffee cup down on the wooden ledge and turned to look at her with the most patient, unhurried pair of gray eyes she had ever encountered. He was lean in the way that men who worked outdoors were lean, all of it purposeful and none of it delicate. His jaw carried several days of dark stubble, and his hat was pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he had forgotten it was there. He was perhaps 27 or 28, she guessed, though the sun had put lines at the corners of his eyes that could have belonged to someone older. His hands, resting on the ledge, were the hands of someone who worked with rope and wood and horses. He looked at her with those calm gray eyes and he said, simply, "Borrow." "For a week," she said. "I can pay $2 now and another $1 when I return it. I just need something sound enough to get me to a homestead north of Wichita and back again." He was quiet for a moment, and she could hear the drover and Otto Krace still shouting at each other outside. The stable smelled of hay and manure and horses, which Sallie had always found to be a smell that meant something close to safety, even when nothing else did. "Whose homestead?" he asked. "My brother's. His name is Thomas Garrison. He wrote me 3 months ago and said he was in trouble, and I have not heard from him since." He picked up his coffee cup and looked down into it as though the coffee might have an opinion about the matter. Then he set it back down and looked at her again. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that comes from owing money to a man named Harlan Croft." The change in his expression was not dramatic. But something shifted behind his eyes, something that went from patient to alert, the way a man who has been watching a calm river suddenly notices the current picking up speed. "Harlan Croft," he repeated. "You know him." "I know of him." Most people in this part of Kansas know of him, or they learn to know of him quickly if they don't. He was quiet for another moment, and she waited because she could see that he was thinking, not stalling. "What's your name?" "Sallie Garrison." Jasper Wells, he said, and he did not offer his hand immediately because he was still thinking and she liked him for it, liked that he did not perform courtesy over thought. Then he said, Miss Garrison, I am going to make you a different kind of offer. She raised her chin slightly. She had been on her own long enough to know that different kinds of offers from strangers were not always to be trusted. What kind? Take my horse, he said. And I will come with you. She stared at him. You do not know me, Mr. Wells. I know you have a brother who owes money to Harlan Croft and hasn't written in 3 months, and I know you've been traveling in bad weather on a dying mule to get to him. He reached for his hat and adjusted it properly on his head, as though the decision had settled something and the hat needed to reflect that. That is enough for me to know that you should not be riding alone to that homestead. Sallie looked at him for a long moment, measuring him the way you measured anything you were not sure you could afford to trust, but were too desperate to turn away. He met her gaze without flinching, without the smug self-importance of a man who expected gratitude for his generosity, without anything that felt like a threat. He simply waited. I cannot promise you more than $3 for your trouble, she said finally. I am not asking for money, he said. Then what are you asking for? He seemed almost surprised by the question, as though the answer was obvious. Company, I suppose. I have been meaning to head north anyway. There is a man in Wichita I need to speak to about some horses. He paused. And the truth is, Miss Garrison, that Harlan Croft has done harm to people I knew. So if there is a chance your brother is in a bad situation because of him, I would rather not leave you to ride into it alone. It was not a declaration. It was not the speech of a hero stepping forward to claim a reward. It was just a man who had looked at a situation and decided the right thing was obvious. Sallie had met enough wrong men in her 24 years to recognize what a right one sounded like, even when she had not been expecting to hear it. All right, she said. When can we leave? I need an hour, he said. I have to talk to Otto and pack what I need. Can you meet me back here in an hour? I can meet you back here in an hour, she said. She turned and walked back out into the Caldwell morning, which was pale and blue and smelled of spring mud and cattle. And she did not look back, because she did not want him to see that her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from the particular exhaustion of having been afraid for so long and suddenly being less alone with it. Jasper Wells watched her go, and then he finished his coffee, which had gone cold. Otto Crace was less than delighted when Jasper told him he would be leaving for a week, but Jasper had worked for Otto long enough that the German's displeasure was more ritual than genuine, and by the end of the conversation, Otto had extracted a promise that Jasper would be back to help with the summer horse sales, which satisfied him well enough. Jasper's own horse, a big dark bay gelding named Anchor, was already in fine condition, and he saddled a second horse for Sallie from among the stable's working stock, a steady roan mare named Pearl that Otto agreed to loan on Jasper's word. He packed carefully and without excess. 2 bedrolls, because there was no telling what the weather would do. Enough food in the saddlebags for 3 days, which would cover the distance to the homestead, and then some. His rifle, which he carried not as a threat but as a fact of travel, because the plains north of Caldwell were still unpredictable with weather and with men. A small medical kit, because Otto's wife had taught him the basics of wound treatment after he had cut himself badly on a fence post 2 years ago, and she had been furious at how little he knew. And a flask of good coffee, because if there was one luxury he would carry no matter the circumstance, it was that. He was back at the front of the stable in 50 minutes. Sallie Garrison was already there, waiting. She had repinned her hair, and she was wearing a canvas riding jacket over her dress, practical and worn in at the elbows. She carried a small bag that clearly contained everything she had thought to bring. When she saw him leading both horses, she looked at the roan mare with an expression that was so close to relief that it hurt to look at directly. Her name is Pearl, Jasper said. She is steady and she has good sense. She will not spook at much. She is beautiful, Sallie said, and she went immediately to the mare and let Pearl smell her hand. then stroked her nose with a gentleness that told him she had been around horses her whole life. They rode out of Caldwell as the morning warmed, heading northeast on the main trail. The Kansas plains opened up around them, enormous and pale gold, the sky enormous above them in that particular way of the flat country, where the horizon seems close enough to touch and far enough away to break your heart simultaneously. The grass was coming back from the winter, short and green and tender, and the wildflowers had started in the low places where the ground stayed wet. For the first mile or so they rode in silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who were not yet sure what to say to each other but were not frightened by the absence of words. Sallie spoke first. "How long have you been in Caldwell?" "About 2 years. I came up from Texas with a cattle drive in the fall of 1876, and I liked the town well enough that I stayed. Otto needed someone to help with the stable, and I was tired of the drives." He glanced at her. "Where are you from originally?" "Missouri," she said. "A small town called Carthage. We moved to Kansas when I was 16, my family. My father had gotten it into his head that the land was better out here." She paused. He was not wrong about the land, as it turned out. He was just not strong enough for what the land asked of him. "And your mother?" "She went 2 winters after he did. The same winter they buried her, Thomas packed up what little there was left and went to try his hand at homesteading. He was always more like my father than he knew, stubborn about land." There was affection in her voice under the worry, the kind of affection that could only come from long years of knowing someone's particular kind of stubbornness. "I went to Abilene because I had a friend there, a woman I had known from Missouri who had married a hotel man. She put me to work." "And you have been there since?" "For almost 2 years. It is not a bad town, better than some." She looked at the horizon. "But I never stopped thinking about Thomas. He writes every month, or he did. He is not a man who forgets his obligations to the people he loves. When the letters stopped, I knew something was wrong." Jasper thought about this. "Tell me what you know about this debt to Croft." She pulled Pearl slightly closer to Anchor so they could speak without raising their voices. "Thomas wrote in January that he had borrowed money from Croft to buy seed and some cattle stock. He said the terms seemed reasonable at first, but that Croft had since been demanding additional fees that Thomas had not agreed to, and that when Thomas had refused to pay them, men had come to the homestead." She stopped. He did not say what the men had done. He only said that he was afraid and that he was trying to find a way out of it. Jasper knew the shape of this story. He had heard versions of it before, had seen what Harlan Croft did to men who could not pay their invented fees. Croft was not a lawman and not quite an outlaw. He occupied that profitable middle ground that existed in the West in 1878, where the law was thin, and the distances were large, and a man with money and men willing to do his work could do an enormous amount of harm before anyone with authority could reach him. He operated out of a small settlement called Greer's Crossing, about 20 miles south of Wichita, and he lent money to homesteaders, and then destroyed them when they could not meet the terms he revised whenever it suited him. "Croft is a specific kind of dangerous," Jasper said carefully. "He does not do the dirty work himself as a rule. He has men who do it. But he has enough friends in the right places that going at him directly is difficult." "I am not going at him directly," Sallie said. "I am going to find my brother." "Yes," Jasper agreed, "and that might be the same thing." She looked at him then, and there was no fear in her face exactly. There was something more complex than fear, something that knew the situation fully and had decided to go forward anyway. He had seen that look on people before. It was one of the bravest things a human face could do. They stopped for noon at a creek crossing where a stand of cottonwoods threw shade over the bank, the leaves just coming in and that particular light green that only lasts about 2 weeks in spring. Sallie unpacked some bread and dried beef from her bag, and Jasper added apples and a small piece of hard cheese from his saddlebags, and they sat on the bank and ate while the horses drank from the creek. "Can I ask you something?" Sallie said. "You can ask me anything," he said. "Why are you really coming?" "You don't know me. You have a job you are leaving, a stable you work for. Otto Crace looked like a man who was deeply unhappy with your decision. She looked at him directly, not unkindly. "What is Harlan Croft to you?" He was quiet for a moment, tearing a piece of bread and looking at the creek. The water was clear and quick from the snowmelt, making that sound that running water makes over stones. "2 years ago," he said, "there was a family named Dutton. Father, mother, 3 children. They had a homestead about 12 miles east of where your brother's land is. They had borrowed from Croft to make it through a bad harvest year, and when Croft decided he wanted their land more than he wanted to be repaid, he sent men to encourage them to leave." He paused. "The father, Edmund Dutton, was a man I had ridden with on the cattle drives. A good man. Honest in a way that not everyone is, the kind of honest that does not need to announce itself." Another pause. "They burned his barn, with 2 of his horses still in it because they wanted him to understand that they were serious. Edmund Dutton moved his family east to his wife's relatives, and he never went back to the land. I heard he died the following winter. His wife said it was the cold, but that it was also the leaving that had broken something in him." The creek ran on over its stones. "So you see," Jasper said, "Harlan Croft is something particular to me." Sallie looked at him for a long moment. "I am sorry about Edmund Dutton," she said. "So am I," said Jasper. He stood up and dusted the bread crumbs from his hands. "We have about 15 miles to cover this afternoon if we want to camp near Grover Spring. It is a better place to stop than the open plain." They rode on through the afternoon, and as the day wore into the golden later hours, when the light came flat and amber across the grass, they talked more. He learned that she was 24, that she could sew and cook and ride, that she had a habit of reading whatever she could find, and that she missed a library she had used once in Kansas City, the way other people missed water in a drought. She told him she had read every book she could find in Abilene, which had not been many, and that she traded books with the hotel owner's wife whenever new ones came through. He told her that he had grown up in East Texas, near a town called Nacogdoches, where the land was pine trees and rivers instead of plains and sky. That his father had run cattle and his mother had taught school, which meant he had grown up with an unusual combination of practical outdoor skills and a decent education, and that reading was something he valued, though he was not certain he valued it as urgently as she seemed to. He told her he had come north on the cattle drives partly for the work, and partly because Texas had felt too small after his younger sister had married and his mother had passed, and there was nothing particularly holding him to any patch of ground. "Do you ever want to have your own land?" she asked. It was late afternoon, and Grover Spring was just appearing in the middle distance, marked by a cluster of taller trees. The air had that particular quality of the prairie evening, still and soft and faintly blue. "I think about it," he said. "A man can get tired of working other people's horses and other people's land. But having your own land out here means having the capital to survive the bad years, and that has been the hard part to come by." He glanced at her. "And I have not had a particular reason to put down roots in one place." She looked at him and then looked away at the horizon, and there was a slight color in her cheeks that might have been the afternoon light or might have been something else entirely. And he found he was watching the side of her face in a way that had nothing to do with the conversation and everything to do with the shape of her profile against the big Kansas sky. He looked away also, at the trees ahead. They set up camp at Grover Spring with the efficiency of 2 people who each knew what they were doing. Jasper built the fire and set up the hobbles for the horses. Sallie found wood and unpacked the cooking things and put coffee on with a competence that made him realize that she was accustomed to looking after herself, that this was not performance but habit. She made a camp supper from the food in both their bags, a simple thing of beans heated in the pan with strips of dried beef, and they ate it beside the fire as the stars came out in that extraordinary way they did on the open plains, where there was nothing to interrupt the sky, and the stars seemed close enough to have warmth. After supper, she sat with her hands around her coffee cup and watched the fire, and he watched the horses and the dark beyond the firelight, which was his habit, and for a while they were both quiet. "Thank you," she said without looking at him, "for coming. I told myself I did not need help. I have been telling myself that for a long time, actually. But the truth is that I was frightened to ride up there alone, and you have made me less frightened, and I am grateful for it." "You do not need to thank me," he said. "I do," she said simply. "People who do kind things should be thanked for them. I think the world gets worse when we stop doing that." He looked at her then, and the firelight was on her face, and her eyes were honest and tired in the way of someone who had been managing alone for a long time, and he felt something shift in his chest, something quiet and significant, the way the ground shifts in spring when the frost finally breaks and the earth begins to give again. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not sound like too much too soon. But he watched the fire with her for a long time before they banked it and turned in, and the spring night was cold and full of stars, and the horses were quiet at the edge of the firelight, and he found it very difficult to sleep. The second day of riding brought them closer to the flat farmland north of Wichita, where the homesteads were spread across the plain at intervals, each one a small assertion of human permanence against the enormous indifference of the landscape. Some were thriving, their fields already showing the beginning of spring green, their barns solid. Others showed the look of places where things had gone wrong, sagging fences, empty pens, windows dark in the middle of the day. Sally's tension increased as they rode, subtle but visible to him now. She sat straighter in the saddle, and her eyes moved from horizon to horizon with an alertness that was more than the usual wariness of travel. They passed through a small settlement called Birch Creek just after midday, a cluster of buildings around a general store and a smithy, and Jasper stopped at the store to ask after Thomas Garrison's homestead and to replenish their coffee supply, which was running low. The storekeeper, a thin woman named Mrs. Adler who wore her gray hair in a tight braid and regarded strangers with the specific suspicion of someone who had seen enough strangers cause trouble, confirmed that she knew of Thomas Garrison. She confirmed it with her lips pressed tight and her eyes moving to Sally with something that was difficult to read, a mixture of sympathy and caution. "He is still on his land, last I heard," Mrs. Adler said, "but he has not been in for supplies in nearly 3 weeks, and there are men at Greer's Crossing who have been talking about his land, which is never a good sign for the man whose land is being talked about." "Is he hurt?" Sally asked, and her voice was very controlled. "Not that I have heard," Mrs. Adler said, more gently, "but Harlan Croft's men have been by his place twice in the past month. I know because the Reeve family, who farm adjacent to the Garrison land, told me so. Margaret Reeve was upset about it. She is a good woman." "Where is the Garrison homestead from here?" Jasper asked. "About 7 miles northeast. There is a creek with 2 big cottonwoods at the crossing. You cannot miss it, and once you cross the creek you will see the sod house and the barn about half a mile up the rise." Sally thanked her. Mrs. Adler put her hand briefly over Sally's on the counter, the kind of touch that women gave each other when words were insufficient, and Sally nodded once tightly, and then they were back on the horses and riding northeast. The 7 miles felt both very long and very short. The land was beautiful in that merciless prairie way, the sky enormous, the grass rippling in the wind, and the afternoon light gold and green and blue all at once. But Sally rode with her jaw set and her eyes forward, and Jasper stayed close beside her, and he thought about what they might find and tried to prepare himself for the various possibilities while also keeping part of his attention on the land around them, because Croft's men had no particular schedule. They found the creek with the cottonwoods and crossed it, and the horses climbed the low rise, and there was the Garrison homestead, a sod house with a solid door and 2 windows, a barn in better repair than he had expected, a kitchen garden along the south side of the house with the winter-dead plants still in it, and the new spring growth just beginning to show between them. A man came out of the barn as they rode up. He was younger than Sallie by a couple of years, which made him 22 or so, broad-shouldered and dark-haired with their mother's eyes, Sallie said later, though Jasper would not have known that. He stopped when he saw Sallie, and his face went through several things at once: relief and shame and love and exhaustion. And then Sallie was off the roan mare before it had fully stopped, and she was crossing the yard, and the brother and sister were embracing with the complete unself-consciousness of people who had frightened each other very badly. Jasper dismounted and led the horses to the water trough at the side of the barn and let them drink, and he gave the reunion the privacy it deserved. Thomas Garrison, when he had composed himself somewhat and been introduced to Jasper, was a young man who had clearly been under enormous strain for months. He was thin in the way of someone who had not been eating well, and there were bruises on his left arm, old and yellow-green at this point, that Sallie noticed, and that Thomas tried to explain away as a fence-post incident that neither of them believed. They went inside the sod house, which was simple and clean and surprisingly solid, the walls thick and cool, the floor earthen but swept. Thomas had a cookstove and a rough table and 2 chairs and a narrow bed, and the small window faced south and let in the afternoon light. Sallie sat across from her brother at the table, and Jasper stood near the door, because he was not family and this was a family conversation. But Thomas invited him to sit, and he pulled up the second chair. Thomas told them everything. The loan had been $400 in the summer of 1877 for seed and 3 breeding cows and a bull, at a rate of 12% interest, which was high but not impossible. He had planned to repay it from the first harvest. But Croft's man had come in September and said that the rate had changed to 18%, and that there were additional fees for the year, fees that had not been in the original agreement, fees that Thomas could not pay because the summer had been dry and the harvest was only fair. When Thomas had protested, the man had come back with 2 others, and they had made clear what the consequences of continued protest would be. The bruises on Thomas's arm were from an encounter in February that Thomas had been minimizing in letters, and then simply not writing about at all, because he was too ashamed and too frightened. He owed, by Croft's calculation, $640, a figure that bore no honest relationship to the original loan. He had nothing close to that amount. What he had was his land, his barn, his cattle, which had grown to 8 cows and the bull and were his best hope of a future, and a homestead he had built with his own hands. Sallie listened to all of this without interrupting, which Jasper thought was one of the more impressive acts of discipline he had witnessed. When Thomas was finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How long before they come back?" "They said they would be back at the end of the month for payment or a decision," Thomas said. "That is in 5 days." Sallie looked at Jasper. He looked back at her. "We need to talk to someone with legal authority," Jasper said. "Do you have any documentation of the original loan, the original terms?" Thomas produced a piece of paper from a tin box under his bed. It was the original agreement with the terms written out. It was not a formal legal document, but it was in writing. It had Croft's man's signature on it as witness and Croft's own mark, and it clearly stated 12% interest for 1 year. "This matters," Jasper said, looking at it carefully. "This is evidence that the terms were changed unilaterally. There is a federal land office in Wichita, and there is a marshal's office. The federal marshal in this district has been looking for grounds to act against Croft for some time, from what I understand. This might be the kind of document that gives him those grounds." "Wichita is 20 miles from here," Thomas said. "That is a day's ride," Jasper said. "If we leave at first light tomorrow, we can be there by afternoon." Sallie looked at her brother. "Can you leave the homestead for a day?" "The Reeves will watch the cattle," Thomas said. He looked at Jasper with the complicated expression of a young man who was not accustomed to needing help, and was finding that it was less easy to resist than he had thought. "Mr. Wells, why are you helping us? You don't know us." Jasper considered how to answer this honestly. "I know enough," he said finally, and I have a particular interest in seeing Harlan Croft held accountable for what he does." Thomas looked at his sister then, and something passed between the siblings, some communication that required no words, and then Thomas nodded. They spent the evening at the homestead. Sallie cooked supper from the supplies in Thomas's larder, supplemented by what remained in the saddlebags, and she made a meal that was simple and good, and the three of them ate together at the rough table in the lamplight. And for a while it felt almost ordinary, like a family supper in any household anywhere, except that it was a sod house on the Kansas plains in 1878, and there were men who would be coming in 5 days to take away everything Thomas had worked for. After supper, Thomas fell asleep in his chair almost immediately, which told Jasper something about how badly he had been sleeping, and Sallie covered him with a blanket and then came outside to where Jasper was sitting on the step, looking at the night sky. She sat beside him on the step. There was not a great deal of room, and she was close enough that he could feel the warmth of her through the cool spring air, and he was very conscious of this and also very conscious of the stars and the distant sound of a coyote somewhere to the west and the solid smell of the sod wall behind them. "He looks older," she said quietly. "He is 22 years old and he looks 10 years older than he should. He has been carrying a heavy weight by himself," Jasper said. "He should have told me sooner. I would have come sooner." She pulled her knees up slightly and wrapped her arms around them. "But I know why he did not. He is exactly like my father. He believes that asking for help is the same as admitting failure, and he cannot reconcile those two things." "A lot of men out here are like that," Jasper said. "It is one of the things the West does to people. The whole idea of it is that a man should be sufficient to himself, should be able to carve a life out of the raw land by the force of his own will. And that is true to a point. But then Harlan Croft comes along and you discover that individual will is not always enough. Women know that earlier," she said, not bitterly, just as a fact. "We learn earlier that we need people, that being alone is not the same as being strong. Men take longer to learn it." She paused. "You seem to have learned it, though." He looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "You came," she said simply. "You did not know me. You had no obligation to me. But you saw that I should not be alone with this, and you came. That might just be stubbornness in a different direction," he said. She laughed, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was warm and quick and entirely genuine, and the sound of it against the quiet prairie night did something considerable to him. "Is it stubbornness?" she said. "Maybe it is the opposite of stubbornness," he said. "Maybe it is just being willing to be needed." She looked at him in the dark, and the lamplight from the window caught the edge of her face, and she said, "That is a good way to be, Jasper Wells." He heard his name in her mouth and felt it the way you feel the sun coming out from behind clouds, physically, across the shoulders and the chest. He looked away at the dark plains. "We should sleep," he said. "Early start tomorrow." "Yes," she agreed. She did not move for another moment, and he did not either. Then she went inside, and he stretched his bedroll out under the open sky and lay there looking at the stars for a long time before sleep came. The three of them rode to Wichita the next morning, leaving before sunrise so that the horses had the cool of the morning. Thomas rode his own horse, a competent little dun named Chance, and Sallie had Pearl again, and Jasper rode Anchor, and the three of them made good time on the Wichita road. Jasper had been to Wichita several times in the past 2 years, and he knew its character. It had been the cattle boomtown of the early 1870s, but the drives had moved south and west with the railroad, and by 1878 it was a more settled place, working at being a proper town rather than the roaring terminus it had been. There was a solid federal presence, a land office, a marshal's office with a deputy who resided there full-time, and a courthouse that handled civil disputes. They went to the marshal's office first. The deputy marshal, a compact and serious man named John Eberly who wore his badge with the quietness of someone who had earned it, listened to Thomas's account with careful attention, and examined the original loan document with the focused expression of a man reading for evidence. He asked several precise questions about dates, and the identities of the men who had come to the homestead, two of whom Thomas could name by reputation if not personal acquaintance. Deputy Marshal Eberly was not a man who made promises he could not keep. He was clear that what Thomas had described was difficult to prosecute without multiple witnesses, and that Croft's arrangement of keeping his own hands clean complicated matters. But he said that the altered loan terms, documented against the original agreement, constituted fraud, and that fraud was a federal matter when it involved land covered by the Homestead Act of 1862. He said he had been building a case against Croft for nearly a year, and that Thomas's documentation was the most concrete piece of written evidence he had yet obtained. He said he would ride to Greer's Crossing within the week. He said he could not guarantee the outcome, but that the situation would not be left unaddressed. "What about the next 5 days?" Sallie asked. "When Croft's men come to the homestead," Eberly thought, "I can send a telegram to the sheriff in Birch Creek. He can ride out to the Garrison property and make himself known. A lawman's presence tends to discourage direct action." He looked at Thomas. "And you should stay off your land until this is resolved if you can. Is there somewhere nearby you can stay?" "The Reeves," Thomas said. "Stay with the Reeves," Eberly said. "Do not be at the homestead alone." They left the marshal's office with the original loan document left in Eberly's hands as evidence, and Thomas had the hard expression of a man who was afraid to hope, but had just been given something to hope about. Sallie walked close beside him, and Jasper watched the two of them together and thought about what it meant to have a sister who would cross 200 miles on a dying mule to reach you. They stopped for a meal at a lunch counter in Wichita, the three of them at a small table with checked cloth, and it was the first time Sallie and Jasper had been in an actual building with a proper meal in front of them since Caldwell, and the hot food and the coffee felt like a particular kind of luxury. Thomas ate with the appetite of a man who had not been eating enough, and Sallie watched him with a satisfaction that was maternal in its texture, even though she was only 2 years older than him. After the meal, Thomas went to the land office to register a formal complaint about the loan terms, which Eberly had advised, and Sallie and Jasper found themselves walking together along the main street of Wichita in the early afternoon sun, and it was the first time they had been entirely alone without the urgency of riding or camping or planning pressing on them. "How are you?" he asked. She looked at him sideways. "Better than I was." "Much better than I was yesterday morning when I was standing in Otto Crace's stable telling a stranger I needed to borrow his horse." "You looked very determined," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "I am good at looking determined when I am terrified. It is a skill I have developed over the years out of necessity." "It is a good skill," he said. "It is exhausting," she said, and then she laughed that warm laugh again and shook her head. "I am sorry. I do not mean to be ungrateful. I am grateful. I am grateful for everything." "Stop thanking me," he said gently. "Why does it bother you when I thank you?" He thought about how to answer this. They had stopped at the edge of the wooden boardwalk, where a hitching rail ran along the front of a dry goods store, and the afternoon street of Wichita moved around them, wagons and horses and people going about their business, and the sun was warm and the air smelled of horses and sawdust, and the green smell of the prairie from beyond the town's edge. "It does not bother me," he said. "It just feels as though you are trying to put a distance between what happened and us. Like thanking me means you owe me something, and owing me something means this is a transaction, and I do not want it to be a transaction." She looked at him carefully. He met her look because he had said the thing and there was no retreating from it. "What do you want it to be?" she asked. The question was quiet and direct and entirely without artifice, and it was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in a long time, which was characteristic of her. He was learning. "I am not sure yet," he said, which was true, "but I know it is not a transaction." She held his gaze for another moment, and there was something in her expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something else, something that was its own distinct thing. And then Thomas came out of the land office down the street and called to them, and they both turned, and the moment was over, but it had left something behind in the air between them. They stayed the night in Wichita at a boarding house, Sallie and Thomas in one room and Jasper in another, which was proper and sensible, and which Jasper found he spent a fair amount of the night thinking about in a way that was not precisely sensible. He lay on the narrow boarding-house bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the way she had asked, "What do you want it to be?" and the way she had held his gaze after. And he thought about the week they had started and how 5 days remained, and how 5 days was both a lot of time and not enough. In the morning, over a boarding-house breakfast that was better than camp food but not as good as Sallie's cooking had been, Thomas asked Jasper a question that was more observant than Jasper had expected from a young man who had been so preoccupied with his own troubles. "How long have you known my sister?" "3 days," Jasper said. Thomas looked at him and looked at his sister and looked at Jasper again, and something in his expression carried the particular perceptiveness of a brother who was not going to say the thing he was seeing, but was going to let everyone know he had seen it, which Jasper found simultaneously amusing and uncomfortable. Sallie appeared to be completely absorbed in her coffee. They rode back toward the Garrison homestead that morning, and the day was warm and clear, the spring fully arriving now, the meadowlarks that lived on the prairie sending up their extravagant songs from the fence posts and the low shrubs along the road. Sallie rode beside Jasper and Thomas ranged slightly ahead, which might have been because Chance was a faster-moving horse and might have been something else, and Jasper did not think too hard about which it was. They rode through a stretch of country that was particularly beautiful that morning, a long valley where the grass ran green to the horizon, and a small river ran through it with willows along its banks, the willows just leafing out in that yellow-green that was almost luminous. Sallie pulled Pearl up for a moment to look at it, and Jasper pulled Anchor up beside her. "I used to think Kansas was ugly," she said. "When we first came from Missouri, I thought it was bleak. Too flat, too empty. I missed the hills and the trees." She was quiet for a moment. "But then you start to see it differently. The sky is so much larger here. There is nowhere to hide from the sky. I think I was frightened by that for a long time. Now I think it might be the best thing about it." "I used to feel that way about the Texas hill country," Jasper said. "The pines and the rivers and the hills, everything was close and enclosed and familiar. Coming out onto the plains for the first time on a cattle drive, I thought it was the most exposed I had ever felt. Like there was nothing between me and whatever the world was going to do." He looked at the valley below them. "But you get used to it, and then more than used to it. There is something honest about land that does not hide what it is." "Yes," she said, "exactly that. It is honest land." Their eyes met, and they were both aware that they had not been talking only about the land, and neither of them said so, and Thomas called from ahead that there was a rut in the road that needed going around, and they rode on. At the Garrison homestead, Thomas went directly to the Reeve farm, a half-mile east, to explain the situation and arrange to stay there for a few days as Eberly had advised. The Reeves, Margaret and her husband Gerald, were the kind of solid prairie neighbors who understood exactly what was being asked and offered everything they had without making it feel like charity, which was one of the things that the frontier produced in people when it did not crush them, a particular understanding of communal survival. Sallie stayed at her brother's homestead to put it in order before they all left it for the Reeve farm. Jasper helped her because there were things to do that required 2 people, and because he was not yet ready to stop being where she was. They fed and watered the cattle. They latched the barn doors properly. Sallie went through the house with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what mattered and what could be left, and she packed the tin box with Thomas's important papers and a few personal things, his mother's Bible and a daguerreotype of their parents, into a bag to take to the Reeve farm. She had the quality of someone who knew how to protect what was important without sentimentality about the rest. "Can I ask you something?" he said as they were finishing up, standing in the clean, dim interior of the sod house. "You can ask me anything," she said, which was what he had said to her at the creek 2 days ago, and he heard it and a warmth spread through his chest. "What will you do?" He said, "After this is resolved, will you go back to Abilene?" She set down the bag she had been packing and turned to look at him fully. The light from the south window was on her face and she looked very clear and very real, the way people do when they are seen without any pretense between them. "I have been thinking about that," she said. "I have been thinking that Abilene is not particularly home. I have been thinking that what feels like home is when I am useful to someone I love." She paused. "And I have been thinking that Thomas needs someone close by, at least until this situation is truly resolved. He should not be alone on this land." She paused again. "And I have been thinking about other things too." "What other things?" he said, and his voice was quieter than he had intended. She met his gaze with that directness of hers that he had come to think of as one of the most distinctly characteristic things about her. "I have been thinking that 3 days of knowing someone can sometimes teach you more than 3 years, when the 3 days are the right kind of days." He crossed the distance between them, which was not very much distance, and took her hand. She let him take it, and her fingers were strong and cool in his. Neither of them spoke for a moment, standing there in her brother's house with the spring light coming through the window and the meadowlark singing somewhere outside. "I do not want to go back to Caldwell," he said. "I mean, I have to speak to Otto and collect my things properly, but I do not want to go back in the way of going back to stay." "No," she said softly. "No," he said. "I have been thinking that this land north of Wichita is good land. That a man who had capital enough could make something of it. That there is a horseman in Wichita I need to speak to anyway, and that the conversation might be longer than I initially planned." She looked at him, and the thing in her face was unmistakable now. "Jasper Wells," she said, "are you telling me that you are thinking about staying?" "I am telling you that I am thinking about reasons to stay," he said, "and that the best reason I have encountered in some time is standing in front of me." She was quiet for a moment, and he thought she might say that this was too fast, that she did not know him well enough. All the reasonable and sensible things that a sensible woman might say, and he would have accepted them, because she was a sensible woman and she had every right to them. Instead she said, "You should know that I am not an easy person. I have opinions and I state them. I am stubborn about certain things. I do not like being managed or handled, and if someone tries to handle me, I push back." She said this the way she said everything, directly, without drama, as simple fact. "And I care very deeply about the people I love, and when I love someone I mean it fully, which some people find to be more than they bargained for. Those all sound like advantages to me," he said. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she turned her hand in his so that their fingers were properly intertwined, and she held on, and that was enough. That was its own statement, and he understood it. "Thomas is going to say something insufferable about this," she said. Jasper laughed, and it felt like it came from somewhere very real in him. "He already looked at us as though he knew." "Of course he did. He is annoying that way." But she was smiling, and the smile reached all the way up into her eyes, and he thought that he had been looking at a beautiful woman for 3 days without quite letting himself look. And now that he was looking, he understood that it was not only the face, which was lovely, but all of it together. The face and the mind behind it, and the courage and the warmth and the stubbornness. They walked to the Reeve farm together, and Thomas was indeed insufferable about it, in the affectionate way of a younger brother who is also deeply relieved. And Margaret Reeve, who was a warm and perceptive woman, looked at Sallie and then at Jasper, and then smiled with the specific satisfaction of a person who likes to see the right things happen. The 5 days at the Reeve farm were the kind of days that rearranged a life. Jasper stayed because it made no sense to leave with the situation unresolved, and because he had a perfectly good reason to be there, which was that he cared what happened. He helped Gerald Reeve with the fence repairs that had been waiting since the fall, because Gerald had a bad knee from an old horse injury, and the fencing was genuinely difficult work alone. He rode out to check on the Garrison cattle daily, accompanied by Thomas, and they began to know each other in the way that men do when they are working together, not through great declarations, but through how a man holds a fence post, and whether he understands which side of a problem to tackle first. Sallie worked with Margaret Reeve in the way of two competent women who had each been handling things alone for too long, and found in each other a temporary luxury of company. They cooked together and talked, and Jasper could hear their voices from the yard sometimes, Sallie's warm and clear, Margaret's lower and more deliberate, and the sound of them was one of the more pleasant sounds of those particular days. In the evenings after supper, when Thomas and Gerald played chess with the battered set that Gerald had brought from Ohio 20 years ago, Sallie and Jasper sat on the bench outside the Reeve farmhouse and talked. They talked about everything. Her years in Abilene, the books she had read, the particular loneliness of being a woman on your own in a western town, which was different from the loneliness of being a man on your own in ways she tried to explain to him, and he tried to understand. His years in Texas, the cattle drives up the Kishom Trail, the things he had seen, and the things he had thought about along the way. What they each wanted from the remaining years of their lives, which was a question that each of them had been circling for some time without quite being able to answer, and which they found, talking to each other, they could suddenly get a little closer to. On the third evening at the Reeve farm, with the sunset going red and gold behind the plains to the west, he told her about the horse operation he had been thinking about for 2 years. A breeding operation, not a working cattle ranch, but horses, because he understood horses in the particular way that came from 27 years of close association, and because a good breeding operation near Wichita could be profitable, could supply the Army contracts and the ranch trade and the growing demand from the farms that were spreading across the plains. He needed capital, a piece of land, and time. She listened with the focused attention she gave to everything that mattered. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Land north of Wichita is not expensive right now, she said. If you had capital, you could buy a good piece. I have been saving for 2 years, he said. Working for Otto, I have enough for a start maybe if the land price is right. Thomas's neighbors to the west had their place come available last fall, she said carefully. The family moved back east. I heard Gerald mention it. The land is good and the buildings are in fair shape. A barn and a house, not sod wood frame. He looked at her in the reddening light. Miss Garrison, he said, with deliberate formality that made the informality of everything between them clear, are you suggesting something? I am suggesting, she said, with equal formality and the brightness in her eyes that was the closest she came to teasing, that a man who wants to set down roots and start a horse operation might find a very convenient piece of land adjacent to people who would be his neighbors. That would be a very interesting development, he said. It would be a practical one, she said. Sallie, he said, abandoning the formality. Jasper, she said. He took her hand in both of his, the way he had learned she liked, with her fingers properly held and nothing uncertain about it. I am going to go back to Caldwell after this is resolved, and settle things with Otto properly and collect everything I own and come back. And when I come back, I would like to come back to more than just a neighboring parcel of land. She looked at him for a moment, and the dying sun was behind her, and the whole sky was warm, and she was looking at him with everything open in her face. No armor, no distance, just Sallie. Then come back to more than that, she said. On the 4th day, Deputy Marshal John Eberly arrived at the Reeve farm with 2 additional deputies, having ridden from Wichita with the documentation Thomas had provided, and a warrant for Harlan Croft on the charge of loan fraud under federal land law. He informed them that he and his men were riding to Greer's Crossing, and that he expected the matter to be concluded within the week. I should be there, Thomas said immediately. You should stay here, Eberly said, with the patience of a man who had said this before. Witnesses who are involved parties do not ride with marshals to serve warrants. That is how people get hurt. You have done your part, Mr. Garrison. Let the law do its part. Thomas looked like he wanted to argue. Sallie put her hand on his arm and he subsided, because she was the only person in the world whose hand on his arm could accomplish that. Eberly and his men rode southwest toward Greer's Crossing, and the waiting began. It was 2 days of waiting, and they were not easy days, because Thomas was restless with the particular agony of a man who felt that his own problem was being resolved without him, which was uncomfortable even when it was entirely sensible. Jasper understood this and worked with him, keeping him busy with physical tasks, because physical tasks were the best medicine for that particular kind of restlessness. On the evening of the second day of waiting, a rider came from Wichita with a message for Thomas from Eberly. Croft had been taken into custody on the fraud charges. 2 of his men, the ones Thomas had named as having come to his homestead with threats, had been arrested as well. The loan document had been officially voided by federal authority, and Thomas Garrison's homestead was clear of the debt. There was work yet to be done in terms of the legal proceedings, and Thomas would be needed to testify, but the immediate threat was removed. Thomas read the message twice, standing in the evening light in the Reeve farmyard, and then he sat down heavily on the fence rail and put his face in his hands and stayed that way for a moment. Sallie sat beside him and put her arm around him and said nothing, because nothing was needed. When he looked up, his eyes were red, but he was not embarrassed about it, which told Jasper something about the depth of what the past months had cost him. "I can go home," Thomas said. "You can go home," Sallie confirmed. Gerald Reeve opened a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a notable occasion, and even Margaret Reeve, who did not generally drink, had a small glass, and they toasted the end of a very bad year for the Garrison name and the beginning of a better one. The next morning, Jasper and Sallie and Thomas rode back to the Garrison homestead. The cattle were fine. The barn was as they had left it. The kitchen garden along the south side of the house had pushed out more green in the few days they had been gone, the stubborn spring growth asserting itself. Thomas walked around his homestead in that particular way of a man relearning the right to something he had nearly lost, running his hand along the fence rail, looking at the barn, standing in the middle of the yard and looking at the sod house that he had built with his own hands. "I am going to build a bigger barn next summer," he said, to no one in particular, "and I am going to bring the herd up to 12 by fall if the grazing holds." "You should plant your garden properly," Sallie said. "You have neglected it." "I have been preoccupied," Thomas said, with a dignity that was almost successful. Sallie looked at Jasper and he looked at her, and they were both smiling at the same time. That afternoon, while Thomas was occupied with his cattle, Jasper and Sallie walked to the western property line of the Garrison homestead, where the adjacent land that had come available began. The boundaries were marked by a line of fence posts without wire, the previous owners having taken the wire when they left. The land was good land, Jasper saw immediately, with good drainage and a small natural pond at the northern end that would be valuable for horses. The frame house was small but sound. The barn was larger than it looked from a distance, with good stalls and a solid roof. He stood there with his hands on the top fence post and looked at it. "What do you think?" Sallie asked, standing beside him. "I think it is exactly right," he said. He rode back to Caldwell 2 days later because it needed to be done, because he had obligations to Otto Crace that he was going to honor properly, because he needed to collect what belonged to him and close out his time there in a way that left nothing undone. He also needed to visit the horseman in Wichita he had mentioned, a man named Cowboy who dealt in breeding stock, and who had been suggesting for some time that there was a partnership worth discussing. Before he left, he had a conversation with Sallie that was very quiet and very certain, the 2 of them standing at the end of the Garrison property near the western fence line with the spring morning around them, the meadowlarks going and the wind moving through the grass. "I will be back in 3 weeks," he said. "4 at the most. I need to sort things with Otto, sell what I do not want to carry, and have the conversation with Cowboy." "I know," she said. "While I am gone, I would like you to find out the asking price on the western parcel. Talk to whoever is managing the sale. "I can do that," she said. He took both her hands and held them facing her. "Sallie, I want you to know that I am coming back." She looked at him with those clear eyes, and he could see that she was working at not letting him see how much the leaving cost her, and he loved her for trying and he loved her for failing slightly, because the fact that it cost her something to watch him go meant something considerable. "I know you are coming back," she said. "You are not the kind of man who says things he does not mean." "No," he agreed. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks, he said. He kissed her forehead, because it was 1878 and they were not yet in a position where he felt it was right to do more than that. And he felt her lean into it briefly, and then he stepped back, and he swung up onto anchor, and he led Pearl behind him because Pearl needed to go back to Otto, and he rode south. He looked back once. She was standing at the fence in the morning sun, watching him go, and she raised one hand and he raised his, and then he rode on. The 3 weeks were the longest of his life. He rode back to Caldwell and returned Pearl to Otto Crace, who was annoyed and satisfied in equal measure when Jasper told him what had happened and that he was leaving properly, giving him full notice, and helping him find a replacement worker before he went. Otto was not a man who expressed sentiment easily, but when the day came for Jasper to leave Caldwell for good, the German shook his hand with both of his and said, "You are a good man, Wells. Go be a good man somewhere that matters to you." He went to Wichita and had the conversation with Calloway, which was indeed longer than originally planned, and resulted in an agreement that Jasper found genuinely exciting, a partnership to supply 3 breeding stallions, and the stud services they represented to a shared roster of clients, with Jasper running the operation from his own land and Calloway handling the marketing end. It was not yet a large operation, but it was the beginning of one. He found a lawyer in Wichita who handled land purchases and sent word through him to the estate managing the western parcel. He could not yet close the purchase because he did not have all the capital, but he secured an option on the land for a modest deposit, which meant it would be held for him while he assembled the remainder. And through all of this, he thought about her. Not in a way that interrupted the practical work, but alongside it, the way a fire in a hearth is always in the room while you are going about your business, warming the air of everything else. He thought about the way she looked at the horizon in the evening. He thought about her laugh. He thought about her saying, "I am not an easy person," which was the most honest warning he had ever been given and also the most unnecessary, because the things she had named as warnings were the things he found most compelling about her. He arrived back at the Garrison homestead 18 days after leaving it, which was slightly ahead of the 3 weeks he had promised, because he had been efficient, and because he was unwilling to stay away longer than he had to. Thomas saw him coming across the rise from the road and said, with the studied nonchalance of a man who had been coached extensively by his sister to be casual about this, "Sallie, someone's riding in." Sallie came out of the house, and when she saw Anchor on the rise with Jasper's silhouette on him, she went very still for a moment, and then she walked out to meet him with the kind of walking that is not quite running but is in the direction of it. He dismounted before they reached each other, and they came together in the yard, and she took his hands and he held hers, and they looked at each other for a moment in the afternoon light with all 18 days of missing between them. "You are early," she said. "I was efficient," he said. "I found out the asking price on the parcel," she said. "I already have an option on it," he said. She blinked. "You did that from Wichita." "I did that from Wichita." She looked at him for another moment, and then she put her forehead against his shoulder briefly, which was a gesture so different from the controlled directness of everything else about her that it moved him profoundly, because he understood it was trust, the very particular trust of showing someone where you were tired. He put one hand carefully against the back of her head, just briefly. Then she stood straight again and looked at him with clear eyes. "Come inside," she said. "Thomas has made something terrible for supper because I was busy today and let him try, and you can tell us everything." "Everything," he agreed and followed her in. The following months were among the best of Jasper Wells's life, which he recognized clearly, and with a gratitude that did not take them for granted. He closed the purchase on the western parcel in June of 1878, when his savings and the money from selling his horse, his extra equipment, and a small debt he was owed from a man in Caldwell combined into enough to meet the price. He moved into the wood frame house, which was small but solid, and he began immediately on improvements to the barn, which needed a new section added to accommodate the horses he was planning. Thomas was a good neighbor in the practical sense. He was also, as promised, insufferable about the other thing, but his insufferability was affectionate and decreasing as the summer went on, and it became apparent that Jasper was not going anywhere. The courtship, such as it was, had the particular quality of something that had already decided itself before either of them had formally acknowledged it. They were together most days, because the two homesteads were adjacent, and because Sallie was making herself essential to the business as well as to the person. She had a clear eye for numbers and a practical intelligence about what the horse operation needed to do in its first year, and Jasper found her judgment reliable in a way that he did not say out loud often enough, because she would not have wanted him to make a performance of it, but which he thought about frequently. The first of Callaway's stallions arrived in July, a magnificent blood bay named Apollo with a temperament that balanced power and intelligence in a way that made even Jasper, who was not given to extravagant praise, say, "There is a horse," when he first let him out. Sallie watched Apollo come off the transit wagon and said, with great conviction, "He knows he is beautiful and it has made him vain." "He is not vain," Jasper said, watching Apollo. "He is confident." "Those can be the same thing," she said. Apollo proved her somewhat right and him somewhat right as the summer went on, and they had this argument periodically with great enjoyment. There were evenings that summer that felt like the whole world had settled into the right arrangement. The prairie in July was a different thing from the prairie in spring, drier and louder with insects, the sky a darker blue, the nights warm enough to sit outside late without coats. They sat on the bench outside her brother's house or on the porch of his own house and talked about everything still, and the conversation had not grown stale in the way he had been warned conversations did once the novelty was gone, because she was not a novelty. She was a person of genuine depth, and genuine depth did not run out. In August, he asked Thomas formally for permission to court Sallie. This was the proper form, and he intended to do things properly. Thomas, who had been expecting this conversation for approximately 3 months, managed to conduct it with considerable dignity for about 45 seconds before his satisfaction showed through entirely. Then Jasper asked Sallie, which was the conversation that actually mattered. They were at the pond on the northern end of his property, the one that was a natural gathering place for the horses in the evenings, and the August light was going orange and long across the water, and Apollo and the two mares were standing at the water's edge in the golden light in a way that was almost absurdly beautiful. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You have asked me many things," she said. "This is a different kind of thing," he said. She turned to look at him fully with that quality of attention she gave to everything that mattered. "I love you," he said. "I have known it clearly since the evening at your brother's place when you said you wanted it to be something that was not a transaction, and I have been letting it settle in me so I could be certain it was real, and not just the particular magic of a difficult week resolving well. And it is real. You are the clearest and most honest and most courageous person I know, and I want to build this life with you, this actual specific life on this actual specific land, with the horses and the garden and the terrible suppers Thomas makes and the meadowlarks in the morning." He paused. "Will you marry me, Sallie?" She was quiet for a moment with the pond and the golden light and Apollo reflected in the still water. "Yes," she said. "I have wanted to say yes for 2 months. I was waiting for you to ask." He felt it in his whole body, the yes of it. He took her face in his hands carefully, and he kissed her properly for the first time, and it was soft and sure and real, and she kissed him back with everything that she was, which was considerable. 2 months, he said, when they stepped back from each other. "You were taking your time," she said. "I was being certain. "I know," she said, and she was smiling. "It is one of the things I love about you. You do not rush toward anything until you know exactly where you are going." "And where am I going?" he said. "Here," she said simply. "You were always going here." They were married in October of 1878 in Wichita, in the small church that had been built there 2 years before, with Thomas at Jasper's side and Margaret Reeve and Gerald Reeve there as witnesses, and Deputy Marshal John Eberly, who had been invited on a genuine impulse by Thomas, and who came with great seriousness and a very good bottle of Kentucky bourbon as a gift. The ceremony was performed by a minister named Holloway, who had a genuinely moving way of speaking about love and permanence, without making either of them sound simple, which Sallie appreciated enormously. She wore a dress that she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding, a dark blue that did remarkable things with her eyes, and she walked into the church with Thomas's arm and walked out of it with Jasper's. And when they came out into the October Kansas morning, the meadowlarks were not singing because it was October and the meadowlarks had mostly gone south. But the light was that particular golden that October makes of everything it touches. And Jasper thought he had never in his life been more certain of anything than he was of that moment. They held a small celebration at the Reeve farm that evening, because Margaret Reeve had insisted on it, and because she was not a woman anyone argued with successfully. There was food in abundance and Gerald's bourbon, and a fiddle player from Birch Creek who had 2 tunes and played them approximately 15 times, and it was a genuinely happy evening in all the ways that mattered. That night, lying awake in the wood frame house that was now unambiguously theirs, with the October wind coming down from the north, and Sally's warmth beside him, and the horses quiet in the barn, Jasper thought about the morning she had walked into Otto Crace's stable in Caldwell with grit on her boots and $3 to offer for a horse she needed to borrow for a week. He thought about the particular calm that had come over him when he had looked at her, the clarity that something right was happening. She was not asleep yet either, he could tell by her breathing. "What are you thinking about?" she said into the dark. "Caldwell," he said, "the morning you came into the stable." "I was terrified," she said. "I know, you looked determined," she laughed softly. "And then you said, 'Take my horse and I will come with you,' and I stood there thinking, this is either the most foolish thing I have ever done or the best. Which was it?" "You already know which it was," she said. He turned toward her in the dark and put his arm around her, and she settled into him with the ease of someone coming home. "I am glad you asked to borrow a horse," he said. "I am glad you had one to lend," she said. The autumn moved into winter, which on the Kansas plains was not a gentle season. The northern winds came down hard in November, and the temperatures dropped fast, and the snow came and stayed, and Jasper was very glad of the solid barn and the improved stalls and the good wood frame walls of the house, which turned out to hold heat considerably better than he had expected. He was also glad of Sallie, who had a talent for making a house warm that had nothing to do with firewood, though she was also very good at firewood. Thomas came through the winter with the Garrison cattle intact and his herd growing, and his confidence growing with it, the particular quiet confidence of a young man who has survived a very bad year and come out on the other side of it knowing he can. He had begun courting a young woman from Birch Creek, the daughter of a family named Whitmore, whose name was Clara, and who had a direct manner and a good laugh that reminded Jasper strongly of her family's connection to the kind of practical cheerfulness that the plains tended to select for. The horse business grew through the winter, slowly and carefully, because Jasper was a careful man with money, and he did not try to expand faster than his capital allowed. But by spring of 1879, the word of mouth from the first season stud services had reached enough ranchers and farmers that the spring brought more inquiries than he had anticipated, and he and Calloway had a conversation about bringing in a 4th stallion by summer, which they did. Sallie managed the books for the operation with the precision she brought to everything, and she did it while also making the house into something genuinely fine, not in the way of expense or decoration, though she had a good eye for both when given the chance, but in the way of having a place that felt intentional, that felt like people who knew what they wanted had made a space that reflected it. She planted the kitchen garden in April, and by summer it was the kind of garden that made Thomas say, coming over for supper in July, "My garden is not this good, and I have been doing it longer." "You do not water consistently," Sallie told him. "I water consistently," Thomas protested. "You water when you remember," she said, "which is different." By the spring of 1879, Sallie told Jasper one morning over the breakfast coffee, with the particular directness that was entirely characteristic, that she was going to have their child. He went still for a moment, the way you go still when something so significant happens that your whole body needs a second to understand it. Then he stood up and went around the table and held her carefully, as though she were suddenly more precious than anything which she was, which she had always been, but which now had an additional dimension that he was still working to fully comprehend. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly well," she said into his shoulder. "I am not fragile, Jasper. Women have babies. I am fine." "I know you are not fragile," he said. "I am allowed to hold you." "You are absolutely allowed to hold me," she agreed, and held him back. Thomas was, of course, insufferable about this also in the very best way. Margaret Reeve, who had delivered more babies than the doctor in Birch Creek, said she would be there when the time came, which was a comfort, because Margaret was one of those women who inspired complete confidence in her practical abilities. The boy was born in November of 1879, a healthy and very loud infant who arrived on a cold, clear morning when the frost was heavy on the grass outside the window, an anchor stamped in the barn as though he knew something was happening. Jasper named him Edmund after Edmund Dutton, the man who had worked cattle with him and lost his homestead to Harlan Croft in Broken when he left it, because naming the boy Edmund felt like a way of saying that the loss was not the last word on the matter, that something good was growing in the same ground. Sallie loved the name. She said it without hesitation when he told her, "Yes, Edmund, it is exactly right." Edmund Wells was a child of great energy and strong opinions, which anyone who knew his mother would have found completely unsurprising. By the time he was walking properly, he was investigating the barn with the determination of a frontier explorer, and had developed an early and absolute passion for the horses, which Jasper found extraordinarily gratifying. Thomas Garrison married Clara Whitmore in the spring of 1880, in the same small Wichita church where Jasper and Sallie had married a year and a half before, and the Reeves were there, and Deputy Marshal Eberly was there again, because Thomas had also taken a genuine liking to the man, and the ceremony was every bit as good as the first one, and the fiddle player from Birch Creek had learned a third tune. Thomas and Clara moved into the Garrison homestead, which Thomas had been expanding steadily. He had built a proper wood frame addition onto the sod house, and had his 12 cows, and was talking seriously about a second bull. He had also, with a prudence that spoke to the hard lessons of 1877 and 1878, diversified into wheat alongside the cattle, which the good soil supported, and which gave him a second stream of income. Harlan Croft had been tried in federal court in Wichita in early 1879 on the fraud charges, with Thomas as a key witness and the loan document as central evidence. 3 other homesteaders had come forward during the investigation with similar stories, and the federal case had been substantial. Croft had received a sentence of 5 years in federal prison, and his operation at Greer's Crossing had dissolved completely when his men scattered at the first sign of legal authority bearing down. The land that Croft had taken from families who could not pay his invented fees was in the process of being reviewed by the Federal Land Office, a process that was slow but that Eberly said was moving in the right direction. It was not a perfect resolution. It was not the kind of justice that gave back everything that had been taken or undid the damage done to families like the Duttons. But it was real and it was documented, and Harlan Croft was in a federal prison cell, and that meant something. Edmund Dutton's widow, a woman named Ruth Dutton living in Missouri with her children, received a letter from Jasper Wells in the spring of 1879, telling her about the conviction and enclosing $20, which was what he could spare, and a note from Sallie that said only that her husband had been a man who was remembered with respect, and that his name was being honored in a way she hoped would bring some small comfort. Ruth Dutton wrote back a month later, a letter of 2 pages that said many things but that centered on the phrase, "It is a mercy to know he is not forgotten," and Sallie kept that letter in the tin box alongside Thomas's important papers. The horse operation grew steadily through 1880 and 1881. By the fall of 1881, Jasper had 6 stallions and a roster of mares coming in for breeding from 3 counties, and the partnership with Callaway had expanded to include an informal agreement to supply 2 string horses a year to the Wichita Army Depot, which was both profitable and good for the reputation of the operation. He hired a young man from Birch Creek named Abel Marsh to help with the stable work, because the volume of it had grown past what one man could manage alone, and Abel turned out to be excellent with horses and reliable in the way that mattered most, which was the way that meant he showed up every morning without needing to be chased. Sallie, between Edmund and the books and the garden and the regular company of Clara Garrison, who had become one of her closest friends, managed all of it with the competence and humor that she brought to everything. There were hard days, because there always were, and the plains were not gentle with anyone consistently, and the winter of 1880 to 1881 was severe enough that they lost 3 of the mares to the cold despite everything they could do, which cost them money and time and hurt in the way of caring for animals. There were the ordinary difficulties of marriage, the adjustment of 2 strong-willed people to the daily reality of each other, the negotiations of space and habit, and the particular stubbornness that each of them had warned the other about, and which each of them encountered in the other with a mixture of exasperation and respect. But there were far more good days than hard ones. There were summer mornings when Jasper came in from the barn, and the breakfast was on the table, and Edmund was at his place with something complicated constructed from sticks and string that he was very serious about, and the light came through the window at a particular angle, and the coffee was hot, and Sallie looked up from whatever she had been reading and smiled at him, and the smile had all of it in it. The recognition and the warmth and the particular intimacy of 2 people who have chosen each other thoroughly and have not regretted it. Those mornings were the best things he knew. In the spring of 1882, Sallie told him over breakfast coffee again, with the same directness as before, that Edmund was going to have a sibling. Edmund, who was 2½ and had opinions about everything, said, when this was explained to him in terms he could manage, that he wanted a brother, and that the brother should be named Apollo after the horse, and this caused a great deal of discussion. The second child was born in October of 1882, and she was a girl. She was given the name Ruth, after Ruth Dutton of Missouri, whose letter was still in the tin box, and whose words "it is a mercy to know he is not forgotten" felt, to Sallie, like exactly the right spirit to carry forward into a name. Edmund took approximately 4 days to decide. He did not actually mind that Ruth was not a brother named Apollo, at which point he became extremely proprietary about her and spent a great deal of time explaining to her, in the serious tone of a child who has information to convey, the many things she needed to know about the horses. Ruth proved early to have her father's quiet steadiness and her mother's eyes, dark and clear and direct, and she watched the world with an attention that even Margaret Reeve, who was not given to extravagant opinions about infants, called remarkable. The summer of 1883 brought a traveler through the area who stopped at the Wells property looking to buy a horse. He was a journalist from a Chicago paper who was writing about the settlement of the Kansas plains, and he was struck enough by what he found at the Wells homestead, the solid buildings and the excellent horses and the neat records and the evident success of the operation, that he asked if he might write about it. Jasper declined, because he was not interested in newspapers, but Sallie talked to the man for an hour on the porch while Edmund showed him one of the horses, and the journalist went away with more material than he had expected, and a genuine impression of what was being built on this particular piece of Kansas. Jasper watched Sallie from across the yard as she talked to the journalist, articulate and specific about the operation, about the history of it, about what the partnership with Callaway had made possible, about the land and what it could do when it was managed with care. She was 29 now, and she was as beautiful as she had been the morning she walked into Otto Crace's stable, but it was a more settled beauty, the kind that comes from a life being lived in alignment with what a person actually is, and he felt the same shift in his chest that he had felt that first evening at the spring, watching her face in the firelight. He crossed the yard. She looked up and saw him coming and interrupted herself to say to the journalist, "Here is the man you should really be talking to," which was generous and also somewhat untrue, because she knew this operation inside and out. The journalist looked at Jasper. "How did you come to start a horse operation on the Kansas plains?" the journalist asked. Jasper looked at Sallie. She was looking back at him with that expression that was its own private language between them. "A woman came into a stable where I was working and asked to borrow a horse for a week," Jasper said. "And I said, take the horse and I will come with you. And I came, and I never went back." The journalist wrote this down as though it were an interesting answer to his question, which it was. Sallie looked at Jasper with the warmth that was the permanent weather between them, and he winked at her, which was not something he did very often, and which made her smile with her whole face. By the fall of 1883, the Wells horse operation was the most respected breeding establishment in 3 counties, and Jasper's name was known along the length of the cattle trails as a man whose horses were sound and whose word was good, which were the 2 things that mattered most in the trade. He had kept both of them consistently, the soundness and the word, because those were not things he had ever been willing to compromise on. Thomas Garrison's farm had grown into something his father would have been proud of, and Jasper thought about this sometimes, about the fact that Nathaniel Garrison had come out from Missouri with the conviction that the land was better here and had not been strong enough for what it asked. But his son was strong enough, and his daughter was more than strong enough, and the land they were farming and the land Jasper was running the horses on was doing what Nathaniel Garrison had believed it could do, bearing well under the hands of people who understood it. In the evenings of that autumn, when the harvest was in and the horses were bedded and the children were asleep, Jasper and Sallie sat on the porch of the wood frame house that had expanded with the family and the years, a proper porch now with 2 chairs, and a view of the pasture where the horses moved in the last light. They sat with coffee or sometimes just with the evening, and they talked or they did not talk, because they had been in each other's company long enough that both were possible without awkwardness, and the comfortable silence was its own form of intimacy. On one such evening in late October, with the air already carrying the edge of the coming winter and the sky going deep purple to the east and the last orange to the west, Sallie said, "Do you remember what you said to Thomas when he asked how long you had known me? 3 days. "I remember," Jasper said. "I have been thinking about it lately," she said. 3 days, that is how long it took for both of us to know." "Some things do not require more time than that," he said. "When you know, you know." "I knew when you said take it and I will come with you," she said. "Not that I was going to love you exactly, but that there was something true in you. That you were someone who could be trusted with the things that mattered." "And have I been?" he said. She looked at him. "You have been everything I trusted you to be and more besides." He reached over and took her hand in the way he had always taken it, properly, with her fingers fully held and nothing uncertain about it. The pasture was quiet below them and the stars were beginning and the horses were dark shapes in the last of the light. "Sallie," he said. "Jasper," she said. "This is the life I wanted," he said. "I just did not know what it looked like until I saw it." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and the wind moved through the grass of the pasture, and somewhere in the dark toward the Garrison farm Thomas's dogs were barking at something that was probably a fox, and inside the house Edmund and Ruth were asleep in their rooms, the two children who were named after people worth honoring and who were carrying something forward without knowing it yet. "We should go in soon," she said. "It is getting cold." "In a minute," he said. She did not argue. She settled beside him and held his hand and looked at the stars with him for another long while, and the Kansas night came down around them, big and clear and honest, the way Kansas had always been, and neither of them moved until the cold really made itself known and the last light was fully gone. Then they went in together, and the house was warm with the fire and the sleeping children and all the ordinary particular things that made it theirs. And Jasper Wells closed the door behind them on the autumn night, and thought that this was the whole of what a life could be when it went right, this warmth and this woman and this land, and that he had found it by saying yes to a stranger who needed a horse and the courage to go wherever that yes was going to take him. It had taken him here. It had taken him exactly here. And in the morning, there would be coffee and Edmund at the table with something complicated made of sticks, and Ruth watching everything with those dark considering eyes and Sallie reading whatever book had most recently come through Wichita, and the horses in the pasture, and the meadowlarks on the fence posts, when the spring came around again, and the day after that and all the days after that, stretching forward across the good honest land into a future that was not promised and not simple, but was entirely and unmistakably theirs.